Hey there, my name is Cameron, better known as Venus Theory, and welcome back to the PSP YouTube channel. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the brand new PSP Saturator and talk about 5 different ways you can utilize it in your mixes. Kicking things off, let's take a look at Saturator to talk about some of the controls and learn a bit about what Saturator is and what it does. To get started, if you just want to start using Saturator in your mix, you can access the presets here at the top, and there are over 100 different factory presets included with Saturator. These are everything from drum enhancers to bass guitar settings to vocal enhancers to even a handful of mastering presets. So it's really easy just to open up the presets, find a couple of settings, and try out some ideas to start using it in your mixes right away. PSP Saturator, as you probably guessed, is a saturation plugin. So here in the center, we have the saturation knob, and this controls the amount of saturation that we're applying it to the signal. The next most important control is directly below that, and that is the shape knob. This allows you to select what type of saturation you're applying, and there are 8 different shapes to choose from. Each of these different modes has a pretty drastic impact on the final sound. Different saturation types can yield very different results. If you're not sure which type to choose from, the best thing to think about is working from left to right here. We have the softer and more subtle types of saturation like soft valve, and as we work over to the right, they get progressively more intense, all the way up to full hard clipping, which is very heavy and intense sounding, but it can be pretty cool. To the left and right here, we have the low and high band processing controls. We have a frequency control, which controls the area that the processing is applying to. We have a warmth control for the low end, a softness control for the high end, and then a level control allowing us to increase or decrease the level of that processing. This is a pretty cool way to either enhance the low end of something or dial it back, or bring up a bit more high end and excitement, or dial it back if it's maybe getting a bit too fizzy and intense. Down at the bottom here, we have the input and output gain controls allowing us to bring in more input signal or dial it back, or dial back the output control to compensate, or increase it to compensate. You can also link these together by clicking the chain link icons, and these will lock to be relative. So if I have this set all the way down here, then we link it, you'll see the controls are actually relative to each other and not absolute, which is really handy. In the center of that, we have the mix control here. This allows you to blend the saturation in parallel, which we'll be taking a look at here in a moment. This is a really handy way to blend in a little bit of saturation without totally overtaking the signal. Over to the far right here, we have the output mode selection. This allows you to have no output processing, saturation being applied to the output, allowing for an additional stage of saturation just to make things glue together a bit more, as well as a limiter control. If you have something that's very peaky and intense, you might turn on the limiter. Otherwise, if you want the peaks to poke through but get a bit of color, the saturation control is the way to go. Over here in the upper right corner, we have the open switch, which allows us to open the processing panel and dial in a few more fine-tuning parameters like the fat mode. We have a sidechain high-pass filter, a smoothing control, a makeup control, and a filter control, which can be routed pre or post here for the high-pass filter. So that's handy to know about if you just need to go in and fine-tune things a little bit just to reshape the saturation and reshape the signal. Overall, Saturator is pretty straightforward to use. Everything's contained nice and neat here on one panel, but you do get enough fine-grained control to go in and dial things in if needed to really shape the sound and make sure it's perfect for whatever you're doing in the mix. With that, let's move on and talk about 5 different ways to use Saturator in your mix. One of the first examples I want to show here is actually on this sub-bass patch. And what I've done is take this sub-bass from something that's very low and fundamental sounding because it is a sub-bass. We can see it's just really that single harmonic. And by bringing in Saturator, I'm able to bring in a few more harmonics to make this translate better to smaller playback systems. If we start increasing the saturation amount, it'll become a lot more prominent, and you can see that in the signal analyzer. There we've almost got kind of a soft square wave going on. So this is a great thing to try out. If you have a bass that's particularly low, or you're working in modern electronic music like this where you would have a sub bass, this is a great way to make your bass translate to smaller playback systems, as well as stand up a bit more in the mix. Using a saturator to enhance your bass signals is a great way not only to improve your mix translation onto smaller playback systems, but it's a great way to add some energy and weight to your bass and your tracks and really make it stand up in the mix. Another really powerful way to use Saturator is as a sound design tool. Here in this mix, I came up with kind of the main bass sound, which sounds like this on its own. Now, that's okay, but in the context of the mix, it really doesn't stand out all that much. That sounds pretty cool, but it doesn't really jump out at you quite the way I wanted it to, and that's why I brought in Saturator. By using the Saturator here and pushing it pretty hard by really cranking the input gain, and I'm using the output saturation as well, combined with modern tape with about 50% saturation and bringing in the low and high band processing, I was able to take that from a fairly traditional acid bassline, I guess, and turn it into something a bit more crunchy and aggressive, and now it sounds like this, which almost entirely changes the timbre and characteristics of the sound. But in the context of the mix, now that bass really jumps out at you. Of course, saturation is a great subtle mix tool by using it in small amounts in different areas of your track to add a little bit of character and heat and mojo, but by pushing things to extremes, you can get some pretty interesting results. Another great trick for saturation in your mix is to apply it in parallel. One of the things with saturation is that it's very similar to compression. In fact, they're almost identical processes, just with a few key differences. With parallel saturation, we can use the excitement and added harmonics of a saturator, but dial it back to retain some of the original signal's flavor. Here, I had a snare, and I've built this snare using 5 different layers. So with that, sometimes it's necessary to glue things back with a bit of compression and EQ. Right now, the snare signal sounds like this. Now, that's fine, but it would be nice if it was a little more glued together and maybe just had a bit more energy. So I brought in Saturator here, really cranked the saturation up quite a bit, and used the high band processing just to add a bit of air and excitement. But if I have this up all the way at 100% mix, I've also driven up the input gain here, you'll notice, so I'm going pretty hard with this, and I've got the Saturator on the output. With this, it starts to sound a little too squashed. We've got a lot of energy going on there, but we've lost nearly all of the punch that the original signal had. So by dialing this back in parallel, we can get that snap and punch of the transient back, but get the added benefit of the added harmonics and excitement from the saturator. So now in the context of the mix, the snare goes from this and becomes this. Saturation can also be great to use as a creative effect. Since this was the reveal music for the new Saturator plugin, I wanted to start things off being fairly clean and then get progressively more saturated and dirty. And this is a great way just to enhance something in your mix, to build up a bit of tension or anticipation, or just build a bunch of energy. I started off here with a pretty clean acid bass line, and the filter opens up. By automating the mix of the saturator here, we go from something that's very clean and pristine to something that's very raunchy and dirty and really builds up the energy and anticipation of the track for when the drop comes in. There are tons of different creative ways you could use saturation in your mixes, and I think a couple of my favorites that you can go try are applying it to a delay send or a reverb send, or blending in really extreme saturation in parallel against a vocal or something like that. The possibilities are really endless because it just comes down to what you figure out and what you want to try. One final way to use PSP Saturator in your mixes is as a master bus, exciter, and enhancer. To do that, just go into here, open this up, and make sure you've got the fat switch on to engage oversampling. We'll dial this back, and then typically what I like to do is a pretty subtle saturation, maybe the soft valve, and then I'll engage the output saturation here. We'll start driving this up on the mix, and we can start to get a bit of heat and grit to things, so I'm gonna mix this in 100%. So we can really start to add quite a bit of energy there. And then from there, we could start dialing in a bit of warmth and some high end just to add some excitement. So let's bring up maybe around 60 hertz or so. And then we'll bring in some energy and top end here, maybe at around 6 to 8K. And that takes our mix from this and turns it into this. When it comes to applying saturation on your master bus, do remember that less is typically more. A little bit of saturation goes a long way, but it's an awesome way to add some excitement and energy to your track with the added harmonics. It's a great way to excite things with the low and high band processors, and it's just a really great way to make your track hit harder without doing a bunch of dynamics processing that can just squash your track down and make it feel lifeless. And that's a look at the new PSP Saturator. Hopefully you found the video helpful, and I hope it gives you a couple ideas to start using saturation in your mixes. If you want to check out PSP Saturator for yourself today, or find more information, you can head over to pspaudioWare.com.